Okay, part two of period 8, 1945 to 1980. This is the domestic side of that time period. We're going to look at what was going on the home front. All right, so first of all, we've got the rise of liberalism. Liberal principles came to dominate post war politics and court decisions. So, especially in the 1960s, is when we're going to see this. And then you're going to have sort of a backlash to this in the 1980s with the rise of conservatism. So there's kind of there's some movement towards the left, and then there's going to be some movement towards the right. The context of this, the image of prosperity of the 1950s was called into question with The Other America by Michael Harrington, where he examined poverty in America and the continued lack of civil rights that remained a problem. You've got Lyndon Johnson, who kind of takes the New Deal from the 1930s, and he expands on that in the 1960s with the Great Society, which dramatically increases the scope and size of the federal government. Some parts of the Great Society program, you've got Head Start, you've got the Job Corps, you've got Medicare and Medicaid, two of the biggest parts of Johnson's Great Society, which still have tremendous impact on the federal budget today. We're going to have the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which is going to end the quotas that had been in place for decades that restricted certain nationalities. So you're going to have new groups coming to America. And then also with regards to liberalism, you're going to have some Supreme Court decisions that really sort of exemplify this liberal movement of the time under the Warren Court. You're going to have Yates versus the United States. The First Amendment protects radical, revolutionary speech. In other words, just because you're a socialist or a communist doesn't mean that you can't speak out. You can still speak out, and you're protected by the First Amendment. Griswold versus Connecticut. This was about the right to privacy. Really, it was about birth control, but the right to privacy was how the court decided this particular case in 1965, that birth control could not be prohibited because it would violate someone's right to privacy. And then you've got Miranda versus Arizona, Miranda rights, where you have the right to remain silent and speak with an attorney, 1966. All of these are expanding individual freedoms and democracies. But not everybody is pleased with this movement to the left. There's going to be criticisms from both the right and the left over some of the decisions and some of the policies that are being put in place during this particular time. Okay, as far as criticisms from the left, on the left side of the screen, you have what those were. We've got many on the left felt that not enough was being done for civil rights and poverty. So you're going to see the rise of black radicalism, the Black Power movement, Black Panthers, and Malcolm X. These are civil rights people who were on the radical side that advocated for violence at times, didn't necessarily even want desegregation. Maybe some of these groups thought that it was good and proper for the races to be separate. Again, what you see is a more radical movement on the civil rights front. People on the left were highly critical of U.S. foreign policy, especially in the Vietnam War. We talked about that a little bit. Reasons for their vehement criticism of the Vietnam War included things like the Tet Offensive, the My Lai Massacre, basically American troops just slaughtering women and children in this community in Vietnam. The bombing of Cambodia. People believe that these policies are immoral, that they do not reflect what the United States should be standing for. The UC Berkeley Free Speech Movement, the Students for Democratic Society, the SDS, they issued the Port Huron Statement. Other new left movements spread across college campuses, and these are often violent. I know the SDS advocated for bombings and things of that nature. And then in 1968, you have the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, in which riots break out. Uh, at this point, Johnson has said he's not going to run for reelection. 68 is a violent year because you've got assassinations all over the place, from Martin Luther King Jr. to JFK's brother, Robert Kennedy, who was leading, probably going to win the Democratic nomination for presidency. So 1968 is a very, very upsetting. It's very it's not a good year for people who want order and peace. A lot of conflict going on during that time period. As far as criticism from the right, Barry Goldwater comes to sort of represent the right wing portion of the country that did not support this growth in government. Uh, they do not support these new moral values that are being trumpeted throughout society. They don't like, they don't like the hippies. They don't like, um, the challenging of traditional values and things of that nature. So he ends up losing to LBJ in '64. Some of his criticisms and those who were like him, some of their criticism. You'll also have uh, Ronald Reagan will sort of make his presence known on the scene here. He's going to give some speeches in support of Barry Goldwater, but he's not going to be a major player for another 15, 16 years. But anyway, back to his criticisms of liberalism. Large federal government, they don't like that. They think the government has too much power, it spends too much, high deficits. They don't support that. They don't support these decisions of the Warren Court. They felt traditional morality was being undermined by the court, by society, by Hollywood. Uh, you know, it was happening from all kinds of different fronts. Roe versus Wade gets decided in '73, which essentially kind of added to the idea of the right to privacy beyond just birth control. Now you can abort an unborn baby. So the right is mobilizing against that particular decision as well. So they don't like the direction of the Supreme Court. They don't like the power of the federal government, and they don't like the direction morally of the nation's society. 1968, with all of the chaos going on, the Republicans nominate Richard Nixon, and he wins. He'll also win again in '72. But he's also going to go through some scandal, the Watergate scandal, essentially where people in the committee to reelect the president for Richard Nixon, they are spying on Democrats at the Watergate Hotel, and it turns into a huge scandal, especially when he tries to act like or tries to cover it up. And trust in government is further eroded as a result. And then in 1980, Ronald Reagan wins the election overwhelmingly with Reaganomics. Well, he was campaigning on Reaganomics, deregulation. He was a big Cold War warrior, anti-Soviet Union kind of stuff. And he is going to be very successful in '80, and then he'll win again in '84. And as a result of his successful presidency, it's going to lead to George H. Bush winning in 1988. Okay, with regards to civil rights, all three branches of the federal government will help to advance the cause of civil rights and greater racial justice during this particular time period, especially in the 50s and 60s. In the executive branch, after World War II, Truman desegregates the military with Executive Order 9981. In the judicial branch, Plessy versus Ferguson, the idea that of separate but equal facilities and things like that, it gets overturned in the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So segregation is determined to be unequal, and it must end with that decision. And then in the legislative branch, you've got by the way, Brown versus Board of Education. That's going to take place in 54. With the legislative branch, Congress will pass the Civil Rights Act of 64, which makes segregation illegal in all public facilities, and established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which will ban discrimination in employment. And you'll have the Voting Rights Act of 65, which will end efforts to prevent African Americans from voting in the South, like literacy tests. Those have been in place since basically the end of Reconstruction. And then in the 24th Amendment, poll taxes will be banned, deemed unconstitutional. So each branch of the government is responding to basically the civil rights movement that's taking place with people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X and other people that are pushing for equality in society, equality under the law, and they're starting to finally make some dramatic progress, especially in the 50s and in the 60s. Civil rights advocates sought to fulfill the Reconstruction era promises and managed to slowly achieve some legal and political success. So, Reconstruction, you've got this revolution, social political revolution for black people in the South. You have the end of slavery, they're voting in large numbers. And then at the end of Reconstruction, it kind of reverts back because Southern politicians who were, uh, who did not support this new social political revolution, they get back in charge in the South and they start passing laws to prevent African Americans from voting and to segregate tremendously in the South. But those promises of the Reconstruction era were still there with the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. And so those amendments are going to be used to get new laws passed to help those promises be realized. World War II energized the civil rights movement. Remember the Double V campaign. You got the creation of CORE. You've got more membership in the NAACP. So we're going to have legal challenges, direct action, nonviolence, some violence. The NAACP is led by Thurgood Marshall. He's the one who won the Brown versus Board of Education case in 54. You've got successful Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. Then you have the sit-ins. They really started before Greensboro, but that's probably the most famous. So Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins, essentially, black people weren't allowed to sit, or they were allowed in these restaurants, but they could only sit in certain areas, and they decided they were going to sit wherever they wanted to, and they were being refused service, and they continued to do this on a daily basis, and it grew and grew and grew. It led to some violence, and it led to finally this lunch counter being desegregated. An interesting story here is that the first black person to be served at Woolworths was a black woman who was actually a server there. Uh, they Whoever was in charge said, "Hey, if we're going to do this, you're going to be our first black customer um, in this desegregated era." The Freedom Riders rode buses into the segregated South, and they are advocating for desegregation. Freedom Summer, this was about voting, going down into Mississippi, especially, and trying to get people registered to vote. So, this is all a grassroots movement to pressure for civil rights into the 60s. This is not an overly large organized group. It's grassroots, meaning that it's people, local communities, and people who don't necessarily have a lot of power who are creating these movements, and they are gaining power as a result of the growth of their movements. Intense resistance slowed the pace of desegregation. With regards to the Brown decision, you have the Southern Manifesto issued, which denounced the Brown decision, criticized the Supreme Court. You've got the Little Rock Nine, where these kids were trying to go to this school in Little Rock, Arkansas. Governor Faubus tried to prevent them from attending school, and Eisenhower sends federal troops in to prevent Faubus from preventing the kids from going to school. But then you also have violence during the Freedom Rides, Bombingham, which was a nickname for Birmingham, and the Freedom Summer murders. Some people who were part of that, trying to get people registered to vote, went missing and were later found to be murdered, probably by the KKK. And of course, you have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Uh, you've got um, you've got the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers. They're a radical, violent group, and essentially they just have different tactical and philosophical differences from people like Martin Luther King, who advocated for nonviolence. Um, so some in the civil rights began to question the nonviolent tactics and philosophy of people like King. The Watts riots in '65 broke out following the arrest of a black motorist by white police officers. You've got Starkly Carmichael, who called for black power, economic power, and racial separatism. Again, you see sort of a big shift here from people calling for desegregation to now people in the civil rights movement, black leaders, saying that no, separatism is good. We don't need to be interacting. Malcolm X joined the Nation of Islam, and he emphasized black nationalism, self improvement, and separatism. The Black Panthers were formed by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland, and they were a violent group. So these are still civil rights advocates, but they're very, very violent, radical type people, very different from Martin Luther King Jr. Here are some other civil rights movements. So for women's rights, Betty Friedan challenged the traditional roles of gender roles in society with her book, The Feminine Mystique. Family structure was changing as the number of women working increased. So you're going to have, you're not going to have the stay-at-home moms to the same extent. Yeah, my generation is known as the latchkey generation. We're the first generation um, to be going to school. Then when they get home off the bus from school, there's nobody home there with them, so they're in charge of uh, unlocking the door, going in, making sure the door is locked, and making sure that they have their, they're responsible for feeding themselves or taking care of their brothers and sisters and things like that. Because you have women who have now entered the workforce in large numbers, and so you no longer have uh, a household with one parent working; you have two parents working. And my generation is known as the latchkey generation because I didn't do this, but some would wear these latch keys around their neck so that it was their home, the key to their home so that they could unlock their door and get in after school. And that all starts to change here in the 60s. The National Organization of Women, NOW, is founded by women's rights activists. You've got Title IX, which sought to end sex discrimination in schools, and this is a big deal for sports later on in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Equal Rights Amendment. Don't worry about that. Roe versus Wade in '73 struck down laws prohibiting abortion on the grounds that they were a violation of a woman's right to privacy. So this legalizes abortion. Other minority groups, the American Indian Movement, founded in '68, brought attention to the plight of Native American people. You've got the Immigration Act of '65. We talked about that, which eased quotas. Um, and then you've got the University of California versus Bach, which upheld affirmative action. Race could be used as one of several factors in admission. And then for the LGBT groups, the Stonewall riots in 1969 led to the birth of the LGBT movement. So you'll see that it will become more mainstream as you get into the '90s and 2000s. All right, now with regards to society and economics from 1950 to 1980s. Rapid economic and social changes in American society in the post war years led to a sense of optimism and increased tensions. You've got the rise of the middle class, increased social mobility, the move to the suburbs, a post war baby boom. Cold War defense spending was a big reason for economic prosperity. Remember, the military industrial complex is concerned about this. Um, and a lot of this growth will take place in the Sun Belt. These are a lot of southern states where a lot of these defense jobs are located, and people are migrating to those areas. Um, the suburbs become a big deal. People moving, remember, all these people have been moving into cities over the past multiple generations. Now they're starting to move out of these cities, but living around them in suburbs. And they're able to do this because cars are more affordable. People are able to drive into the cities from their little suburb homes. These suburbs, they all kind of look the same. Levittown is an example of that. All these houses are built the same. They're built almost like an assembly line process. Um, and this kind of contributes to the conformity that's taking place. And speaking of conformity, you have television becomes a common household item, contributed to the homogeneity of American culture. In other words, conformity. People are watching the same shows, they're listening to the same, or they're watching the same entertainment, they're watching the same news, they're kind of all experiencing the same things on TV, and therefore you have some conformity uh, that's even multiplying here in American society. Some challenges to conformity. You've got the beat movement and rock and roll. The beatniks were these were people who these were essentially writers who were very critical of what was going on in society in the 50s. 1960s, you've got the rise of counterculture, the hippies. They rejected many social, economic, and political values of the previous generation. You've got the sexual revolution that takes place in the 60s, birth control, the pill, access to abortion, Roe versus Wade. All of this contributes to the sexual revolution. People are, they feel like they can have sex with uh, as many people as they want, and there are no real repercussions because the big fear had always been about getting pregnant. Now that fear is diminished dramatically. This counterculture is they really reject the traditional values of not just politics but religious values and other things of this previous generation. And a lot of these are going to be the hippies. Um, these challenges led to significant political and moral debates, and it led to a backlash, the rise of the conservative movement and Christian fundamentalists in the 1980s, especially. There's this fear of juvenile delinquency, urban unrest, challenges to the traditional family, perceived failures of the federal government policies like the New Deal and Great Society, um, all led for these people to promote their own values and ideology. So just make sure that you know about um, the conformity that existed, and then those who rejected it in the 60s and that conflict that was created. And again, this all kind of relates to Vietnam and the Cold War as well. So that's not something to leave out of this equation here. And that is it for the domestic for domestic policy from 1945 to 1980.